Morning, John.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you today?
Good, good. It's an early start.
Yes, it is. Little frost on the pumpkin.
I don't know what that means.
It means it's a little nippy. Hello, my name is John. This is my 1973 Moto Guzzi Eldorado. This is a police bike I've owned for just a few years. I purchased this from a friend of mine, Steve. I knew that this was a very special bike and was very happy to buy it, and I have never regretted owning this bike. It is so very different than some other vintage bikes I have because it's a real cruiser. I didn't know the brand that well, and as time has gone on, I've learned a lot more about the history of Moto Guzzi and the importance of the bike and the heritage of Moto Guzzis. For those that don't know about Moto Guzzis, they're, I believe, the longest running motorcycle manufacturer at the same plant in Mondello del Lorio on Lake Como in Italy. It's a beautiful place. It's almost like a resort. And yet there's this factory that's been producing bikes there since 1921. So many beautiful bikes have come out of, and they're all handmade. In the 50s, the manufacturers of motorcycles were doing quite well, but then there was the advent of the Japanese bikes that started to come in, and that changed a lot the British bike industry with the Triumphs and the Nortons and so forth. And the Italian manufacturers, Benelli, Moto Guzzi, Ducati, they were not spared by the economic changes that were afoot. But just as importantly as the introduction of the Japanese bikes was the introduction of inexpensive automobiles, the Volkswagen Bug, the Fiat 500, the Mini. Those cars were so inexpensive that a motorcycle no longer was what was common for transportation. A car could be afforded by regular families, and so a motorcycle became more for touring, for sport. And so manufacturers had to rethink a little bit what kind of an offering they wanted to have for the consumer. Moto Guzzi had been making a nice living selling police motorcycles throughout the world. They had sold in the 50s the single-cylinder 500cc Falcone was the bike that was sold all over North Africa, Egypt, all over the world you would find that bike, but it was starting to get long in the tooth. They needed to come up with some sort of a new bike, so they started thinking along the lines of a bigger bike, and they developed the V7, which was also introduced in the United States, and the Berliner brothers, Joe and Mike, that were the importers from the East Coast, started realizing that perhaps there was a market here in the United States where they could sell their motorcycles to police forces here. The Los Angeles Police Department was considered a trendsetter by other police departments throughout the country, and so if there were motorcycles that were adopted by the Los Angeles Police Department, then other police departments throughout the United States would be more inclined to also want to purchase motorcycles. So the Berliner brothers, being quite intelligent about these things, I think through their premier automobile company, one of their divisions, brought some bikes in. The Ambassador, which is the bike that was before the Moto Guzzi Eldorado, and the V7s, and some were sold to the LAPD, and they wanted some changes. And actually, one of the Berliner brothers flew to Italy, and in the evening he saw their motorcycle that they had to offer, and he made some suggestions. For instance, the key on the left-hand side, the ignition key, a longer kickstand that could be engaged while you were still atop the bike, and a few other things that the police would like to have on their bikes. And by the morning when he came back, they had a bike designed with just the few things that he had mentioned. He went back and reported, these guys will build us what we want. And so the Los Angeles Police Department bought a few bikes and then bought some more. An interesting side note was that as they were being adopted by police departments, Moto Guzzi was in some financial trouble, and there was a man named Alejandro de Tomasa, and he was an Argentina race car driver, and he also owned automobile dealerships, and I think he did pretty well. And the Ford Motor Corporation bought him out, and he took some of his money and he went to Italy and he bought a controlling interest in Benelli. And then the next year he went to Moto Guzzi and he arranged to buy Moto Guzzi. And so what happened is, unfortunately, he was more interested in the Benelli four-stroke multi-cylinder bikes and some two-stroke bikes, and he neglected the Moto Guzzi brand some. And one of the mistakes I believe he made is the Eldorado, that was very popular and very well received by the American public because it was pretty much the European Harley-Davidson. Built to cruise, long open stretches of road. Well, Di Tommaso decided that this bike represented the legacy of the past. And since he was the new big cheese of the company, he wanted to eliminate the Eldorado, and he did. And people still wanted the Eldorado, which was only built in 72, 73, and 74. And then to finish off with the police department, and it's a big story and would take too long, but I believe in May of 1975, the Los Angeles Police Department took possession of their last 130 Eldorados, and this was long after the bike had already been discontinued. So it's kind of a shame, because I think this bike had long legs. They could have continued to develop, and this bike could have had a couple more improvements and a few more years of a run. The 73 is a front twin leading shoe. The 74 has a disc brake. This same bike, the Eldorado in Europe, is called the 850 GT. It's the same bike. Some of the differences between this bike and an Ambassador, which are very similar, and one of the club members in the vintage group has one, an Ambassador, and it's a beautiful bike. The difference is that the Eldorado, in comparison to the Ambassador, is a 5-speed transmission. The case and the transmission case have additional webbing on them externally and internally, because they were having some problems with the case. And so that's strengthened so that they didn't have some catastrophic failures. This bike, of course, has the floorboards. It's a left-hand shift. The bike is a 850cc. The Ambassador was a 750cc. The Ambassador and the Eldorado both have an 83mm bore, but they stroked this bike out, so they went from 73mm to an 80mm stroke. I probably got the number wrong, but in essence they increased the stroke, therefore the torque and the horsepower went up. And the bike, as an 850 stock, has a pretty respectable 64.5 horsepower at about 6,500 RPM. This bike has a big bore kit from Cycle Garden, which is down in Indio, California. This is a fella named Mo. He's an expert. I believe he used to be in Huntington Beach, and then he moved to Indio. And his big bore kit has German forged pistons. They changed the shape of the piston a little bit, the dome. They also went from an 83mm bore to an 88mm bore. In essence, 100cc more, so a 950, and about a 15% increase in horsepower and torque. And of course, for a cruising bike, I think torque is probably more important than horsepower. The bike is really quite a nice cruiser. It has the police dash, which I think makes it unique and a little harder to find. It does not have a rev meter. It doesn't have a tachometer on there. You don't need it. I mean, you're going to use your ear, and these bikes really like to rev. They have a lot of mid-range grunt, but they rev and they really kind of get up on rails and get moving, and then everything just kind of smooths out as they go. The bike has double pull Tomaselli throttle. It has the shouldered rims on there. They're 18s. This bike's dressed with Dunlop tires. On the newer bikes, the drive case back here was improved, and it has a nice sump, and it has a pan you can drop on there so you can change the oil. And there were some metal filings in there, and so I've changed out the oil 3 times to get all those filings out from the bearings. But thankfully, all of those metal filings was from the back side of the case here and had nothing to do with either the shaft or the gears, because they lap the gears, and so you have to be very careful that if you do change the gears, they have to be lapped properly so that they mesh and they fit properly. It's very common for these old Eldos that people buy them and they're unaware, because some of them have a lower plug and they put 250 cc's of gear oil in the back and they require 350. So a lot of rear drives have been ruined by guys that accidentally put the wrong amount. I put 350 and then I add some moly in there just so to kind of lube it up a little bit. And for motor oil, and I'm not going to get into that discussion, but I add a little zinc to it as well, which I think is very helpful to these bikes. I've added crash bars to it. I've added these guards. A beautiful thing about the Moto Guzzis, of course, is that you have perfect access to adjust your valves and to do retorques. I've done 2 retorques on it, and so I wanted to treat the bike like I was running it in again. And so I was careful as I was getting to know the bike a little better not to ask too much of it. This bike and I have been on a few adventures. Took this bike to the National Moto Guzzi Rally in John Day this year, and it was my first time ever having been to one of these events, and it was fantastic. I met lots of wonderful people. The fellowship, just all the fellas there, the meals, the guest speakers they had. It was a beautiful event and very special to me, and I thought, well, what a great adventure for an old coot like me to get to go do. I slept in the mountains in the Ochocos on the way there. I have a set of Wigsum panniers for this bike, and they look very nice on it. I'm kind of a minimalist that way, and I did not bring a tent. I just brought a tarp. Part of the history of this bike is on the back here, there's a little placard and it says Moto Guzzi Classics. And this is Mark Etheridge, who owns this company, and it's in Signal Hill, California on Redondo. He's been at it for 44 years. He is, I think, an artist. And so this bike, he probably had it, if I had to guess, in the late 90s. The bike has a top speed of 118 miles an hour. On some of the open roads out in Central Oregon, big long stretches when there's nobody, I've opened it up some, and it really does just get up and it rides so smoothly when you get up at a higher, it wasn't 118, but let's say around 100. You felt very comfortable. It didn't feel dodgy at all. You know, you felt okay on the bike. The mufflers on the bike, I really like the sound of them. I think they sound wonderful. It has the Dietz type lights. The gas tank, which was another requirement, the police department, they wanted a bigger gas tank. What was unusual about these bikes is that there's no Kickstarter on it, but it's got an automobile-sized battery in there, a big sturdy battery, so that you can feel comfortable that it's not going to let you down. These bikes had at one point a history of developing a real severe wobble, a tank slapper at a high rate of speed, and as a matter of fact there were some rather tragic accidents early in the development. It's thought, and I don't know that anyone knows for sure, that when the police departments had them and they weighted it down with all of their radio gear back here, and they had this rather questionable fairing design, and they think that maybe the aerodynamics of the fairing, the weight of the radio receiver here and all this changed it. Nonetheless, after a few accidents, they were asking to have the bikes shipped back to Italy, where one of their test riders at Moto Guzzi actually was killed on one of these bikes. So they said, that's it with the wobblers, bring them to us, we destroy them. We don't care if it's the frame or if it's how you've outfitted the bikes, we're getting rid of those, because they wanted to make sure to instill 100% confidence in their consumer and in the police departments. It has a heel-toe shifter. I'd never had a heel-toe shifter, and at first I was, I didn't really know. Well, I can tell you now, it's the bee's knees. It's wonderful. I love it. It is just so comfortable to ride on. And the floorboards, same thing. At first I was like, oh, what are these? They're wonderful. They really are. It also has this wonderful long kickstand, and I believe that the center stand is really worth mentioning, because for a rather heavy bike, 580 pounds wet, I believe, for an older bike, pretty heavy. The stand is very nice because you just stand on it and it really comes up pretty easily. I'd read an article in a magazine, it was at least a decade old, and it talked about a man by the name of Phil Winter. And because the police bikes have a twist-off gas cap, whereas the civilian bikes have a flip-up. Well, as everybody knows, if you have one of these, when you pull up to get some petrol, you put this up on top of the gas pump, or you figure out where to put it. And this man machined and made and chromed this beautiful gas cap holder. And so he was selling these about a decade ago, and I'd read this dated magazine article, and there was an email address, and so I just dropped him a line. And I said, sir, if you have one of these, I would love to buy one from you. I just think it would look wonderful on the bike. And he relayed to me in an email, he said, I no longer have bikes, but I have one laying around and I'd like to send it to you. He wouldn't take my money, and I wanted to pay for it. He even sent me the correct 8 and 6 millimeter stainless steel and chromed out hardware for it. So I just wanted to mention that how much I appreciated his thoughtfulness, and also I think it really adds a little bit to the bike, and they're somewhat unusual, so other fellas that may have one of these, this is probably something that you don't see very often. Now on the Ambo, it doesn't have the tall neck or the screw-off cap. It has the flip-up, so there wouldn't be any need for having that. It's been a joy. It is a privilege, and I also realize that with this bike, I'm a custodian, and so I really try to take good care of it so that when I pass it on someday, this is one of those bikes that I could just never part with, because I'm truly in love with it. It's just such a wonderful bike.
All right, John. Take care. Thanks a lot for coming over.
Very nice to see you.
Thanks very much for watching, guys. This has been another tale from the cul-de-sac. Please remember to subscribe and click the little bell and you'll get a notice whenever I release a new video, usually every Sunday morning and sometimes during the week.